having grown up in Hungary, made me rather interested or predisposed to ponder the connections between theory and practice, or Marxism and the actual workings of communist systems. And I suppose I didn't know it at the time. It's sort of predetermined by occupational choice. I mean, I have become a sociologist, but I could also have become a political scientist or historian, and I would have written about the same things. Obviously, my professional interests are rooted in my personal experiences, and I pondered this question a great deal. In general, the relationship between ideas and behavior, not just Marxism and communist systems. But as far as Marxism and the Soviet Union is concerned, I would like to start with a wonderful quote from Kolakowski, whom I'm sure you are familiar with his writings. This is something I quoted many times in my writings. And this is what he said in his in the epilogue of his huge work, The Main Currents of Marxism. Quote now, "Marxism has been the greatest fantasy of our century. It was a dream offering the prospect of a society of perfect unity, in which all human aspirations would be fulfilled and all values reconciled. The influence that Marxism has achieved, far from being the result of or proof of its scientific character, is almost entirely due to its prophetic, fantastic, irrational elements. It is certainly not based on any empirical premises, but simply on the psychological need for certainty. In this sense, Marxism performs the functions of a religion, and its efficacy is of a religious character. Marx combined his romantic dreams with the socialist expectation that all needs would be satisfied in the earthly paradise," unquote. Well, there have been three positions, I would say, taken about the connection between Marxism and the Soviet system and other communist systems for that matter. And one position, that was the official Soviet position, that of course they embraced and applied Marxism and were in the process of implementing all his ideas and ideals. And each of the major Soviet leaders, Lenin, Stalin, and perhaps even after Stalin, they considered themselves interpreters of Marxism, applying it to the current situation. And of course, then there is the second position has been that Marxism had very little to do with the Soviet system, that it was a autocratic, nationalistic system which simply used Marxism to legitimate itself. And I mean, that was a Western critique, but again, even in the Western world, there have been divisions among observers and interpreters of the Soviet system. I think Western intellectuals who sympathized with the Soviet system, they wanted to believe that it was in the process of realizing Marxism, because Marxism was a respectable ideology and of course had these ideals which impressed Western intellectuals. So there was a pressure to ignore the differences between reality and practice. And above all, I think Marxism, or the apparent use of Marxism as the guiding force of the Soviet system, also convinced favorably predisposed intellectuals that the system really had extremely idealistic goals. And I will come back to that. Of course, that eventually we realized that this fantasy of a communist society. But I mean, another way in which some of the critics consider the Soviet system a form of Oriental despotism, and they emphasized that the Russian history, the past, made it impossible to really try to create a socialist society. And of course, this was obviously one way in which what they called earlier the Soviet experiment deviated from the ideas of Marx, because they tried to create the socialist society in a non-capitalist system, a semi-feudal system where the majority of the population were not industrial workers but peasants. So in Marx's view, this was not an appropriate setting for trying to create a socialist society. Now, the third point of view, which I share, that Marxism was an inspiration and a major influence on the system without determining every characteristic of it. So the system had something to do with Marxism, and the question is, in what respect, what particular policies or institutions reflected the Marxist orientation. Well, obviously, nationalizing the means of production reflected Marxist beliefs that you can create a just society without exploitation if you nationalize the means of production, and thereby you get rid of exploitation. But of course, this didn't happen. In fact, concentrating the ownership of the whole economy in the hands of the state made exploitation of the workers much more efficient. And of course, they were not allowed to have trade unions because the official premise was that the state, the party state, represents the interests of the workers, so you don't need unions. So, I mean, clearly there was a conformity or harmony between these ideas of Marx and the policies of Soviet leaders, but the results were not what was expected, The ownership of the means of production didn't create social harmony, didn't remove exploitation, and didn't improve productivity either. And then another obvious expectation was that the Soviet system, because of this affinity with Marxism, would equalize society, but instead new forms of inequality were created, and as most of you know, new forms of privileges were created which were not dependent on income, but on affiliation with the party, the nomenclatura, the privileged elite who had better housing, better medical care, travel privileges, and so forth. So Lenin's idea that the state, even just before the revolution, in State and Revolution, Lenin argued that the state, quoting Engels, that the state will start withering away because of the prevailing social harmony, so there will be no need for an exploitative or coercive organ to keep check on social conflicts. Well, of course, this was a grotesque misperception of what was to happen, because the Soviet system created major coercive organizations, and bureaucracy expanded greatly. And in fact, arguably, the Soviet system was the first to create the most complex and highly differentiated coercive systems, political police forces. Most recent incarnation was the KGB. Now, this is very little time to go over these major issues. I would like to say that the crucial way to summarize the relationship between Marxism and the Soviet system, that there was no conflict between the ideas, but the attempt to realize them created completely unintended and unexpected results. And I think one more point could be made, that those people who thought that the Soviet Union or the former Russia was not a good place to try to create socialism, I think they have been increasingly vindicated by developments since the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the initial attempts to create a democratic society didn't go very far. And what we have now is a revival under Putin of the Russian autocracy. I think it's quite remarkable, as I was reading in the paper this morning, that Putin doesn't want to celebrate the anniversary of the October Revolution. I mean, that's very telling. And of course, finally, the other unfortunate and regrettable circumstance is that a large proportion of the Russian population is not unhappy with the situation. They want order and predictable ways of life, and they support an autocratic leader like Putin. So I am not very optimistic about the future of Russia, which I'm sure the other speakers will confirm. Thank you for your attention.
Vladimir.
Thank you, Marion. And I want to, first of all, thank our hosts here today, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the Hoover Institutional Library of Congress. And a special thanks to the Executive Director of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Marion Smith, for the invitation. It's an honor to be a part of this centennial commemoration conference, and it's an honor to join distinguished colleagues on the panel. I guess with the first panel, so we're opening up the entire event. So I'm going to start right at the beginning in 1917. And I'm going to start with the provisional government. The government that came to power after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in March of 1917. And the reason it was called provisional and the provisional nature of that government and the provisional mandate of that government was conditioned by the fact that it was only supposed to hold power until the moment of the election to the All Russia Constituent Assembly. That dream of many generations of Russian liberals, of a national parliament elected by universal, direct, and equal suffrage on a secret ballot with the powers to determine the future contours of a Russian democratic state. The preparations for that election began in earnest in the spring of 1917, and a special commission was formed with the task of drafting the election law, and it was chaired by Fyodor Kokoshkin, a prominent Russian jurist, co-founder of the Constitutional Democrat Party, a former member of the First State Duma. And the election law was ready by August of 1917. And it brought about what were at the time the most democratic election rules anywhere in Europe, with a minimum voting age set at 20, with suffrage for women, with no restrictions or limitations based on education, religion, ethnicity, or property. And the election date was set for September the 17th. But in August, Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, decided to postpone the election by about 8 weeks until November the 12th. He cited political instability and the need to clarify some further matters relating to the election law. Those 8 weeks were probably the most consequential postponement in 20th century history. Because, of course, on October 25th, I'm using old-style dates, so November 7th, new style, the date we marked yesterday, came Lenin's "yesterday was too early, tomorrow will be too late," as the Bolshevik Party, with the help from soldiers of the Petrograd garrison and sailors from the Baltic Fleet, physically seized key infrastructure in Petrograd and took control of the Russian capital. And after a week of heavy fighting in Moscow, which included the actual shelling of the Kremlin by the Bolshevik-controlled artillery, the ancient capital of Russia succumbed also. So by the beginning of November, the Bolsheviks were in control of two most important political centers in Russia, Petrograd and Moscow. But the expectations for a constituent assembly were so widespread and so strong that the Bolshevik usurpers could not cancel the election straight away. So the vote on November 12th went ahead, and the Bolshevik Party was humiliated, receiving just 22% of the national vote. And even with their allies from the left SRs, the leftist Socialist Revolutionary Party, they could only control about 1/3 of the seats in the newly elected assembly. The election, the first ever election in Russia held on universal suffrage, was won by the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, a moderate, democratic, left-wing party that represented the interests of Russia's peasant classes and that advocated for a parliamentary republic as opposed to the dictatorship of the proletariat. The leading liberal reformist party in Russia, the Constitutional Democrats, won representation too. They got about 5% of the national vote and 17 seats in the new assembly. But they were not able to take up those seats. On November the 28th, Lenin's Council of People's Commissars officially designated the Constitutional Democrats as, quote, enemies of the people. This was the first official use of this term by the Soviet government. All leaders of the party were declared outlawed, the party itself was banned, and 2 elected Constitutional Democrat legislators were actually arrested when they attempted to attend the session of the assembly and later brutally murdered by left-wing sailors in Petrograd. And one of those 2 was Fyodor Kokoshkin, who had presided over the drafting of the election law. The assembly itself met for only one day, January the 5th, 1918. It refused to ratify the Bolshevik declaration of a Republic of Soviets, and instead declared the Russian Democratic Federative Republic. Minutes after doing so, the assembly was forcibly shut down by the Bolshevik guards. That infamous phrase by the sailor Anatoly Zheleznyakov, the commander of the Bolshevik Guard of the Tauride Palace, "Karaul ustal," the guard is tired, is now in all the history books. That was the end of Russian parliamentarism for 7 decades. Public demonstrations in support of the assembly were forcibly put down, with dozens of people killed in Moscow and in Petrograd. And the dispersal of those demonstrations and the murder of the 2 elected members of the Constituent Assembly from the Cadet Party are generally considered to be the first act in the Bolshevik Red Terror. Lenin himself called it, and I quote, "a complete and open liquidation of democratic forms for the sake of revolutionary dictatorship." His right hand, Leon Trotsky, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, was just as candid in his assessment when he said, and I quote, "We are not at all hiding or glossing over the fact that we have violated the formal law, nor are we hiding the fact that we have used violence," end of quote. It was only the beginning of the decades-long communist violence against the Russian people and other peoples subjugated under the Soviet Empire. It took the Bolsheviks 5 years of a bloody civil war to take full control of the country, a war that gave rise to several innovations, if I can put it this way, including what is generally considered to be the first concentration camp in Europe, opened on the Solovetsky Islands in the northwest of Russia, and the first instance of the use of chemical weapons against civilian populations during the suppression of the anti-Bolshevik uprising in Tambov, the Antonov uprising. And the violence did not, of course, end with the Red Terror and the Civil War. After them came the forced collectivization, the artificially created famines, the war against religion, the deliberate targeting of entire segments of the population, the clergy, the intelligentsia, the military officers, the Great Terror of the 1930s in a hunt against enemies of the people, forced deportations of entire nations and ethnic groups, the anti-Semitic campaign against cosmopolitanism, and other chapters in the history of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There's no consensus among historians as to the total number of victims of the Soviet communist regime, but the most oft-cited figure, if we include those who were executed, those who were killed in the famines and deportations and collectivizations, and those who were forced to emigrate from Russia, the most oft-cited figure is usually about 30 million people, 30. That is about 1/5 of the total population of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1920s. History knows few crimes of such magnitude. And we have still not fully come to terms with this history in Russia. After the fall of communism in 1991, the new democratic leadership in Russia did take some steps to try to account for the Soviet past. Some of the Central Committee archives were opened. A law passed by the Russian parliament in 1991 to rehabilitate the victims of political repression acknowledged the repressive nature of the Soviet regime, acknowledged, I'm quoting from this law, the decades-long terror and mass persecutions, end of quote, carried out by the Soviet communist regime. And an ordinance from the Russian Constitutional Court, this is the highest court of justice in the Russian Federation, passed in November 1992, 25 years ago this month, officially recognized that, and I quote, "The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was the initiator of repression directed at millions," end of quote. But this process stopped halfway. The archives that were opened were very soon resealed. A full condemnation of the old regime never came. And illustrations against former Communist Party apparatchiks and former KGB operatives were never introduced. And just a few years later, one of those former KGB operatives, or as they like to say themselves, there's no such thing as a former KGB operative, by the name of Vladimir Putin, came to power in our country and began to bring back many of the methods as well as many of the symbols of the Soviet past. But that, I think, is a subject for another panel. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you,
to take
Vladimir.
part.
I'm going to try to say something about communism as an international movement as a way of getting at the theme of this panel, which is the relationship between Marx, Engels, and other early communists and the movement itself. So simply what I want to argue, in the same spirit of Paul Hollander's remarks, is that it would be strange to imagine that two people or a small group of people writing in the middle of the 19th century would be able to write in such a way that they would direct and significantly influence later events. But the thrust of my argument is that in some ways, or in many ways, the way in which Marxism was used creatively by figures like Lenin or Mao Zedong or Fidel Castro and others had a far greater incendiary effect than if the Bolsheviks had merely emulated works from the mid-19th century. If you read figures like Lenin, for example, you immediately notice the many, many references to socialist revolutionaries and Marx himself. But what is more important is the way in which they were able to convince people by using these very simple references to create an international movement. And of course, as the theme of the foundation emphasizes, to engage in absolute acts of inhumanity. Now, what my short paper does, which is called Karl Marx, the Manifesto and the Roots of Global Communism, is simply to take one work, which is the Communist Manifesto, and think about what it offered to future generations of revolutionaries. Sometimes political theorists and philosophers will dismiss the manifesto as a serious intellectual work, and certainly that's true. It was a tract, but it provided ways of looking at the world that could be manipulated by revolutionaries down the road. Now, what many scholars stress is the fact that Marx's and others' immediate prophecies did not take place. World War I showed that the international proletariat was not going to link arms, but instead focus on their individual patriotic loyalties. Secondly, the revolution, when it came, despite Marx's and Engels' and others' prophecies, it came to a backward state, a backward empire, and that is Russia instead of to the industrial West. But these truisms aside, I think that the manifesto offered a framework for looking at the world and understanding revolutionary possibilities that was much, much more attractive than what it said literally. And in a book that I've just written called Vanguard of the Revolution, I try to spell this out, looking at the development of the Communist Party over a period of roughly 150 years from the mid-1840s. So there are three powerful ideas that I think the manifesto offered that could be drawn upon in multiple and varied contexts. The first thing that the manifesto offered was the conviction that the party's cadres were involved in an heroic movement that was destined to succeed. An heroic movement that was destined to succeed. And particularly one that could be understood in terms of fairly simple dichotomies between majorities and minorities. That would make sense in peasant countries, that would make sense in colonial states or ex-colonial states, that would make sense in, as well, modern industrial states. Secondly, I argue that The manifesto offered a sense of belongingness. It offered to followers in vastly different contexts the possibility of finding a community in fractured times that they didn't otherwise have. And finally, my third point, the manifesto offered to these people the opportunity to visualize themselves as agents of virtue, as heroes who were committed selflessly to making a better world. So much for the ideas. Even though my book focuses to a great extent on the power of ideas in influencing revolutionaries, ideas can't by themselves shape and cause revolutionary movements. And for a variety of reasons, what are required are individual leaders, individual revolutionaries who have the imagination to manipulate them across distinct settings. In this paper, I go into various ways in which these leaders, people like Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin, and others, use these ideas and why they found root in fertile but different ground. But I also emphasize the way in which the manipulation of these ideas had tragic consequences. In different ways, Stalin terrorized the party and destroyed it. In contrast, Mao Zedong used the idea of the Communist Party to destroy the organization of the Communist Party, but nevertheless, tragic consequences. And I also emphasize in this paper and in the book the perversity of these consequences. Because in a strange way and puzzling way for scholars, and certainly in my own career, people were able to see the ideas as a justification for unfathomable atrocities. So instead of looking at Stalin's action as atrocities or as misguided failures, they looked at his behavior as a sign of the existence of enemies of the people in their societies. Mao Zedong was very much the same way. And then finally, I conclude with some reflections about the future. When I look at the world that was communist today, I'm struck by the fact that even in countries that call themselves communist, like China, Laos, Vietnam, and Cuba, all of the essential attributes of communism, all of these foundational ideas have withered away. On the other hand, as I emphasize at the end, this doesn't mean that we should expect that international movements like communism, whatever they are called, might and may well recur in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.